I have found a scroll of the Torah. In Hebrew, that phrase is very simple. Sefer HaTorah מצאתי. That precise phrase was uttered by a man by the name of Hilkiah. Some of you have heard of Hilkiah. Hilkiah was a high priest. We're going to talk today about a great discovery. We're actually going to talk about two great discoveries. The first one that Hilkiah was part of, where he says, Sefer HaTorah מצאתי, I think is fascinating. I think it's one of the most incredible stories in all of ancient literature, particularly the Hebrew Bible. Now, I've borrowed the words of Hilkiah for my talk today, and you might say that's a bit bold to say what Hilkiah said, but I truly believe that just like Hilkiah, I have found a scroll of the Torah. Now, my job today is to present the evidence that suggests that I might be right. If you'll work with me and consider that I might be right. You know, in a case of law, Dave talked yesterday about being an attorney. You weigh the evidence, you look at the facts, you consider the evidence, and you put it all out there. And then the people listening, the jury, has to make the decision. When I wrote the book, one of the things that I did was I concluded with, there you have the evidence. You don't have to believe me. But if the evidence persuades you, at least a little bit, that quite possibly I'm telling the truth when I say I have found a scroll of the Torah, I want you don't have to admit it to me, but I want you to think seriously about these things. In 2019, I gave a talk at a United Israel World Union conference. It was the last time that we met in person before COVID, BC we call that, and I was presenting this topic, finding the hand of Moses, the Torah within our Torah. I'd never heard the name Shapira. I've never read the name Shapira at that time. But what I began to look for and find, I believe, was evidence within the Pentateuch, within the 5 books attributed to Moses, that suggested that within that precious sacred document, there were levels of holiness, I should say. There were things that put me more on the trail of what Moses actually wrote. We know that traditionally, Moses is given the credit for writing 5 books, the 5 books of Moses. Open any English Bible, Jewish or Christian, and that's usually what's going to be at the top. The 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But over a detailed study over several years, I began to question that. And when I began to question something, I don't want to leave any stone unturned, because I believe these are matters of very serious nature, particularly when it comes to what I put my name to when I say I believe something. You know, years ago, I read a passage from another sacred body of literature, and it said you shouldn't all jump, and I'm paraphrasing, you shouldn't all jump up to be teachers because there's a harsher judgment. Well, you know, I still believe that. I still believe that when I present something, I better do my best to present it as best I can, covering all the angles, because I don't want to steer anybody else wrong. It's one thing if Ross steers Ross the wrong way, but it's a whole nother thing if 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people that download a class buy into something that isn't the truth. So I'm very guarded. I want to make sure that I do everything I can to advance the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So today, I'm going to talk about not one great discovery, but 2 great discoveries, which could very well be the same thing discovered twice. The first great discovery took place 2,644 years ago about this time. It was around Passover in the year 622 BCE, during the reign of a young king by the name of Josiah. I think we have a Josiah in the room. So Josiah is probably, I've mentioned before that if at the end of days this comes up, who would you like to talk to in all of history? I've got a shorter list than you might imagine, but Josiah is one of those people. And some might say, well, why would you pick Josiah? I can think of other people. This is my list. You pick who you want. I'm hoping you pick other people because the line will be shorter. But Josiah is one person that I'd like to talk to. He's 8 years old when he assumes the throne. And he assumes the throne at 8 years old because his father is assassinated. So he's put into this position of leadership. He assumes the leadership of a quite rebellious people, I might add. But he's taken care of, senior advisors and so forth. But 8 years old. Now think about this a lot. Now one of the things that I wanted to start with is the idea I wrote in my book about Josiah. This is what I said. Josiah stands above all the other kings mentioned in Scripture. He's the only, underline, I didn't underline in the book because that's not allowed, right, Don? But he is the only descendant of David whose birth was prophesied. And according to the writer of Kings, that prediction was made some 300 years in advance, and it names him. Open your Bibles to 1 Kings 13:2 if you have it. If you don't, I promise to read it accurately. In 1 Kings 13:2, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall slaughter upon you the priest of the shrines who bring offerings upon you. That's interesting, by the way. And human bones shall be burned upon you. So here we are, 300 years prior to the birth of Yoshiyahu, and he's named in 1 Kings 13. Now, when the author of Kings describes the career of Josiah, look at 2 Kings. In 2 Kings, let's do I think we'll do 2 Kings 23. Yeah, I had to think if I wanted to do another one. 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 24. And it says, Josiah also did away with necromancers and the mediums, the idols and the fetishes, all the detestable things that were to be seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem. Thus he fulfilled the terms of the teaching, in Hebrew it's Torah, recorded in the scroll that the priest Hilkiah had found in the house of the Lord. There's no king like him before who turned back to the Lord with all his heart and soul and might, in full accord with the teaching of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. Now there is another passage in Kings where another king is described as being the greatest, but I'm going with this one. We can talk about why there are two kings that are the best of the best. But Josiah, interestingly enough, when a scroll is found by Hilkiah, he immediately accepts it. He alters the course of his life and the course of a people. Many of you have been to Biblical Tamar Park. Among the archaeological ruins, there is an altar that was found outside the gates of this Judean fortress. And it dates archaeologically, scientifically. We can date this event, a smashing of cultic items to the time of Josiah. Josiah and his people went throughout the land of Israel from Dan to Beersheba. They bashed all the idols in the land. Interestingly enough, it says that Josiah when it describes his turning to God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his, some translations say mind, with all his, here really it means with all his everything. Heart, soul, and everything, if heart and soul doesn't cover it. Well, that's a Deuteronomic phrase. It comes from language that's only found in Deuteronomy. And in fact, Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, you know the Shema. The next verse, you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your everything. And here we have Josiah. A scroll is discovered, and he seems to match in his behavior what is found in Deuteronomy. Could be coincidental. The events of Josiah's life are covered in two sections of text, 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, and 2 Chronicles chapter 34 and 35. Now, I show this all the time when I teach. This is like really fun and exciting and informative. It's called a synoptic harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles with related passages from Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezra. If you look at the section that I'm talking about, I hope all of you carry this with you in addition to your Bible. It's handy. It actually shows the text harmonized side by side. So you have the account in 2 Kings 22, 23. You have the account in 2 Chronicles 34, 35. You look at them side by side. Now, there are differences between Kings and Chronicles. If you expect it to read identically, you have some surprises in front of you. So we are in the 18th year of Josiah's reign. Josiah is 8 years old when he assumes the throne. He is now, you're all great at math, 26. He's 26 years old when this scroll is discovered in the temple, and that's the story that we're going to focus on. Now, he feels inspired by God to restore and renovate the temple. Now, the temple has been renovated before, but it's been 218 years. The time before the 622 BCE renovation took place in the time of a king called Jehoash. Jehoash renovates it. So it's gone 218 years. Now, you can imagine, it's in ruins. The writer of this particular text in Chronicles says this, that they gave it to the carpenters and the builders to buy quarried stone and timber for binders and beams and for buildings, which the kings of Judah had let go to ruin. Now, if you have an impression in your mind that the kings and priests and the people of Israel were faithfully following the Torah of Moses and performing the rituals and rites in the temple, read this book again. In 2 Chronicles 34, 14 and 15, it says this, while they were bringing out the money that had been brought into the house of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord given through Moses. And Hilkiah said to Shaphan, Sefer HaTorah Matzati. Sefer HaTorah Matzati. I have found a scroll of the Torah. Now, if that scroll of the Torah had been out in the open and everybody knew about it, the response would have been, okay, that's good. Great. We would expect it to be there. But it's a shock. You found what? Now, the interesting thing about the phrase here is that this indicates that this is not just any scroll. Like I have scrolls of the book of the Torah, right? I have lots of books behind me. You could say, I found the Torah. Well, it's not hard to do in this building. But he's not talking about a copy, you understand. He's saying, literally, in the Hebrew, he's saying, I found the scroll that Moses wrote. This is not just a copy, but rather the very scroll, the original. It's written by the hand of Moses, it says, B'yad Moshe. Now, B'yad Moshe, by the hand of Moses, is very straightforward. It means this is the one, Moses' hand. I'm assuming he's right-handed. Some of you left-handers, James and others, might argue, Bridget. but he's got to be right-handed. I'll explain that later. But he writes this Torah. It's Moses. So at the time of the discovery, this would have been several hundred years old. Now, if it depends on when you date Moses. So some would say 1500 BCE, some would say 1200 BCE, or any variation thereof. But either way, do the math. From 622 BCE, you're looking at 5, 6, 7, 8, several hundred years. And that's what he found. Now the question becomes, notice he calls this the Torah of Yehovah, this teaching that was given through the hand of Moses. The question becomes, if we read this closely, can we discern what was in it? Was it like that behind you in that cabinet? Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34:12. Is that what he found? It's what a lot of people would think. It's the Torah. Or was it something else? Now, a couple of things as we get into this. There's no physical description that we read. Like it doesn't say, well, it was written on leather of this nature. It was kind of thick. It was written with this color ink. We don't get those kind of descriptions. We have to ask. All it's called is a sefer. Now, what is sefer? We say book. A lot of English translations say book, and you go, well, the codex didn't come in. It wasn't a book. Maybe it was a scroll. So we then say, well, sefer means scroll. But what does it really mean? See, we're talking about a medium to communicate something which is written. Sefer is tied to other words that we know from Hebrew, like a sofer. You know what a sofer is? One who counts. It's a scribe. So one who counts, okay, so what is sefer? Maybe it's an account. Maybe it's just a simple way to say account. But was it in a scroll form? Or was it folded? Was it folded or was it rolled? And you said, well, sure, it was rolled. We know that scrolls were rolled. We even have Dead Sea Scrolls that were rolled. So I got curious. I said, where do we get the idea that in antiquity they rolled the scrolls earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls? Qumran, the scrolls date, and the other places we found ancient scrolls in Judean wilderness and so forth, we date these to about 100 BCE or so, give or take, right? But what if there was something older? Were they rolled then? Possibly. In fact, I have a text I want you to look at. I want you to look with me at Isaiah 34:4. Isaiah 34:4. And while you're turning there, I had other questions about this particular scroll that was found. Was it written on leather or papyrus? It's a good question. I mean, we don't know. Doesn't say. Do we know the dimensions? Was it according to the dimensions of a modern scroll? Was it the size that an Ashkenazi scroll is, or a Yemenite scroll? Was it 19 inches tall? I don't know the metric system. But was it this long? We don't know. So here we go in Isaiah 34:4. It says the following, and this is, by the way, not related to the discovery, but it has to do with my subject. All the host of heaven shall molder; the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. And all their hosts shall wither and. So you think, well, so in my mind, I've read this verse many times, you have as well. You imagine that Isaiah pictures the heavens and they roll up to where it looks like a Torah scroll. But is that what it means? Behind this, there's a phrase that's associated, we know, such as, you've heard of a Megillah, or Megillat, Sefer Megillat, a roll. It's typically translated a scroll that's rolled. Here, the root word in Isaiah 34:4 is galam. So I said, okay, so what is a galam? What does it mean? Does that give me evidence as to what the scrolls were, how they were put together in the time of Isaiah? And so I looked it up, and it really means wrapped up, folded, or folded together. Well, that's an interesting point. I'll come back to it. Megillat Sefer. I'm building a case here. Go with me to Jeremiah 36. Jeremiah 36. And in Jeremiah, interestingly enough, we have a little bit of information about a Megillat Sefer. You know the passage in Jeremiah 36, I mentioned it earlier in the conference because it has the name of Baruch. It gives us a good idea of how Jeremiah and Baruch work together. And I love this. I'll get to it. In Jeremiah 36, verse 2, get a scroll. This is God talking to Jeremiah. Get a sefer and write upon it all the words that I've spoken to you concerning Israel and Judah and all the nations from the time that I first spoke to you in the days of Josiah to this day. All right, so there's Jeremiah. His teaching begins in the days of Josiah, which we're talking about, and he says, write everything down. Now, a lot of scholars believe, and I believe, that this is the direction for Jeremiah to write the book of Jeremiah. Notice that it's in the book of Jeremiah. It's like looking at yourself in the mirror, and a mirror, and a mirror, and a mirror. Now go down to verse 4. So Jeremiah called Baruch, son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote down in the scroll at Jeremiah's dictation all the words which the Lord had spoken to him. So then there's trouble. The boys are in trouble. They're on the ropes. They're being questioned intently, or Baruch is. And they have him, you imagine the light bulb dangling over his head, and they're all pressing in on him. They said, tell us how this happened. They have to bring this to the king, right? And I love this, verse 17 of Jeremiah 36. And they questioned Baruch further, tell us how you wrote down all these words that he spoke. And he answered them, he himself recited all those words to me, and I would write them down in the scroll in ink. Very simple process. Now, so we know that a scroll means an account. We don't know really if it's rolled or folded, but it could be either. We also know that there's some kind of ink involved. We know this from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There have been studies published on scientific assessments of the ink. So you could tell what's in it. Is it carbon-based? Is it, what's in it? And you can then use that to help you date it. So when we talk about the scrolls from antiquity, and we get to this chapter in 36 where God speaks to Jeremiah about the writing, I believe, of Jeremiah, it says that he was a prophet from the days of Josiah. Go back with me to Jeremiah chapter 1, and I want to pick up here to lay the groundwork. So in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, son of Hilkiah. Make sure you heard that. One of the priests of Anatot in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him in the days of King Josiah, son of Ammon of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. And then it goes on to describe the length of Josiah's reign. Now, the thing that I want you to understand is that in the 13th year of Josiah's reign, Josiah is 21 years old. So Josiah's 21. He's got 5 years before the scroll is discovered. It's 5 years prior to the discovery of the scroll. Now, how old is Jeremiah? I like to picture Jeremiah and these other biblical characters as the Bible describes them. Jeremiah is called to the ministry, if you will, as a prophet at a young age. In fact, he says, I'm a na'ar. He tells God, I'm a youth. You've given me this job and I'm just a kid. Well, na'ar can be used to indicate a teenager. So this is just Ross. This is me. I think a na'ar here, Joseph at 17 in the book of Genesis is called a na'ar. So let's work with me. Let's say that Jeremiah is 17 and Josiah is 21. These are two young guys. And they're about to embark on the greatest discovery of all time. You say they? Yes. The son of Hilkiah. Jeremiah is the son of Hilkiah. His dad, Jeremiah's dad, is a priest. Interestingly enough, the priest who discovered a scroll in the house of the Lord's name was Hilkiah. Now, are they the same? You could say, well, there were a bunch of Hilkiahs. Maybe, but I don't think so. In this case, I believe, and this is where I'm telling you, this is my view, doesn't say, and oh, by the way, this later Hilkiah would, but I think he does. I think it's the same guy. Now, Jewish commentators would agree with me, or you could say I agree with them. But we agree that Hilkiah, the father of Jeremiah, is Hilkiah the priest who discovers the scroll. Doesn't have to be. It doesn't mess up my case. But it helps it if I'm right, so I'm going to put it in the notes anyway. Jeremiah, if his father is the discoverer of the scroll, could have actually seen this scroll. Could have. I'd give it a 5 on a scale from 1 to 5. Interestingly enough, we have this text where Jeremiah says something that doesn't make sense unless he somehow knows about the discovery of a great scroll. He tells God in Jeremiah chapter 15 and verse 16, "When your words were found, I ate them." When your words were found, I ate them. And you could say, well, that's just too general. Maybe, well, it's funny that he is the prophet when God's words were found in the house of the Lord. I say, if A equals B and B equals C, A equals C. He says, when your scroll was found, I ate it. Literally? No, he didn't eat it literally. He means he devoured God's word. Now, he's not the only prophet to do that. Go with me to Ezekiel. Let me give you a visual of this. And by the way, remember Jeremiah, God's hand reaches out and he puts his words in his mouth. That's symbolic. It's like a vision. I think it's the eating of this scroll, but I'm not going to go there. I'd rather give you this picture. Go to Ezekiel chapter 2. Ezekiel chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. And it says this, "You mortal, you son of man, vata, you mortal, heed what I say to you. Don't be rebellious like that, a rebellious breed. Open your mouth and eat what I'm giving you." And as I looked, there was a hand stretched out to me holding a written scroll. And in fact, in Hebrew, it's Megillat Sefer, right? The two together. He unrolled it before me. Unrolled. Well, if you trust the English here, you imagine it's rolled up. And it was inscribed on both the front and the back, and on it were written lamentations, dirges, and woe. He said to me, "Mortal, eat what's offered to you. Eat this scroll and go speak to the house of Israel." So I opened my mouth, and he gave me this scroll to eat. And as he said to me, "Son of man, feed your stomach, fill your belly with this scroll that I give you." I ate it. It tasted as sweet as honey to me. Then he tells him, look, you're going to go to the house of Israel, and this is not going to be an easy job. You don't have an easy job. You're going to tell people things they don't like, they don't appreciate, and that's the life of a prophet. So if you ever wanted to be one, read the book, and you won't again. So the idea, though, is that the message, Ezekiel, that's a different scroll. Don't get me wrong. It's a different scroll, but it's a way that God gives his word inside the prophet. You devour God's word. Now, in the days of Jeremiah and Josiah, when this scroll was found, Jeremiah eats it. And so what I would expect is that if he ate the scroll, I think he ate, he says, when your words were found, and they were found in the temple during his time, he eats it. I would think that he would speak forth that which he's eaten. Fair enough? Like he's not going to eat a scroll that says, "I love you," and say something opposite. It has to do, his preaching will have something to do with the scroll that he ate. Now let me tell you a couple of things that he says. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8. He says this, "Who are we to say that we are wise and the Torah of the Lord is with us when the lying pen of the scribe has made it a lie?" How well you think that went over? Okay? So this idea, now people can dance around this, but this is stern. He's suggesting that the Torah has been altered. Now, why would he say that? What if, just work with me, what if a scroll was found, then he knew that there was another scroll, there was another idea of Torah in his day, but a new scroll is found, he eats it, and he realizes that the two don't agree. Interesting. Give Give you another example. Look at Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 21. This is Jeremiah preaching, not Ross. I'm just echoing Jeremiah's words. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 21, and it says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat the meat. For when I freed your fathers from the land of Egypt, I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offerings or sacrifice." What? Well, that's interesting, because I could have swore that the Torah has a lot about burnt offerings and sacrifices. Maybe I've missed something. "But this I commanded them, do my bidding or obey my voice, and I will be your God and you should be my people. Walk only in the way that I enjoin upon you and it'll go well with you." Yet they didn't listen, etc., etc. So the idea is that when he preaches forth a message, he seems to be saying some very tough things. They're not well received. They're not popular. They're not, the list goes on and on. So the original scroll of the Torah was discovered or found in the days of Josiah and Jeremiah ben Hilkiah, Jeremiah the son of Hilkiah. Jeremiah is a priest. He's a particular priest, a priest from Anatot. Well, Anatot's where I would expect to find priests. It's a priestly city. But he's from that area. In fact, there's a whole nother story, but I'll have to do that a later time. But look at the book of Kings and what Solomon does when he banishes a priest that was faithful to his father. Solomon's not the greatest guy, by the way. All right, study his life. A lot of people he has a lot of wisdom, but you say he wasn't so wise in a lot of areas, right? We know that. Okay, so Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, claims to have devoured God's words when they were found. He talks about the lying pen of the scribes. He claims that certain things that they firmly believed in were not from God. That'd get you kicked out of the Baptist church. And it wasn't like God said, "Look, just tell a little group in your gathering about this. I want you to go to the gate go to the temple. You stand right there, Jeremiah, and you tell them what I tell you." And remember, the prophets, a lot of time, they're like, if you could pick somebody else, maybe that'd be just swell. It's been long noted the similarities between Jeremiah and Deuteronomy. Most scholars note this. Can we know for any certainty what was in the scroll that Jeremiah ate? Can we know for any certainty what was in the scroll that was discovered by Hilkiah? We can. Particularly when we look at what follows the discovery. When we look at Josiahs Reform, Josiahs Reform gives us a lot of details. Now, I covered a lot of this in 2019 in my class. If you haven't heard Finding the Hand of Moses, you can listen to that. I didn't want to give you exactly the same thing I gave you 2 years ago, and it's also in my book. But this idea, we know for a fact that when that scroll was discovered, Josiah implemented a radical reform that went throughout the entirety of the land of Israel. And in that reform, he does things. And when you do things, you could say, well, what's the driver behind that? And you say, well, where was it commanded that these things be done? And almost without exception, in fact, I can't think of an exception. I did this when I taught this last time. It's all Deuteronomic. You can say, well, there's some of Leviticus too. Only when Leviticus has what Deuteronomy has. You do it tick by tick by tick. Check them off the list. Now, the preponderance of evidence suggests that the scroll that was found was a form, stick with me, of the book of Deuteronomy. A form of. I'll qualify that. I covered this in chapter 17 of my book, by the way. Now, I want to read a section from the book, and by the time I finish this lecture, you don't even have to buy it. I'll already cover it So, but this is in the book, and it's just a paragraph. And it says, if I can get to the page, Josiah's reforms are connected to instructions that are found in D. Scholars refer to Deuteronomy as D. But I'm not teaching the documentary hypothesis here. Let's call it Deuteronomy. The narrative of Josiah's making those reforms is told in terms and phrases that are typically found in D. And Josiah's reforms are traced to the promulgation of a particular scroll, which is identified by the same words as the scroll that Moses writes in D. The interlocking chain of connections led to the extremely widely held view in scholarship that the scroll that was read in Josiah's day was D. Listen to this. This is from the Jewish Study Bible, one sentence. The contents of this scroll and Josiah's and the people's reaction to it suggest that it was some form of the book of Deuteronomy. The evidence says so. So the discovered scroll was a form of Deuteronomy. Whenever the discovery happens, Hilkiah hands the scroll to Shaphan. Shaphan is the scribe. In the English, I think it says he's a secretary. John Langberg is a secretary. This guy's a scribe. Hands it to the Sofer, who is Shaphan. Shaphan reads the scroll like it doesn't say, and he read it, and he read it, and he read it. You say, well, it doesn't tell you a time limit, but get this. He reads the scroll, like you get the impression, here Hilkiah says, Sefer HaTorah Matzati. And he says, let me see. He picks it up and he says, oh, and he reads it. And he says, we have to take this to the king. Like it doesn't take him, like I'll get back to you next week. He reads it. And then it says he takes it to the king, and guess what he does? He reads it to him. Now this doesn't give the impression that this is the longest document, like War and Peace. It's a short document. He reads it twice in a couple of sentences, and I'm going to give you some more information about that. Large or small. Now, a couple of other details emerge. If Hilkiah gives it to Shaphan and Shaphan reads it, it doesn't say he tried to read it, but he couldn't read it because the script was different. It doesn't say that it was written in a language he didn't understand. He could read it. Now, what language was prevalent in Judea at that time, and what evidence do we have archaeologically of a certain script? So I can almost tell you what script was used. I have tables of ancient scripts based on true life archaeological discoveries. Some form of paleo probably, what we would call Phoenician or paleo script, some form. Doesn't say he has any trouble reading it, he just reads it. Now, the idea that the scroll of Moses was a document of smaller size is also supported by several other facts in the Bible. In Deuteronomy chapter 27, we read that there's going to be, it's all been all in the news, by the way, there's going to be a ceremony at Ebal and Gerizim, and you're going to have the blessings and the curses, right? So this document is not only to be read there, but guess what else you do? You write it on stones. You know how many rocks you'd have to write on to write Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34:12? You want that job? Now, I know a lot of people say, well, no, it really was. You just had to write small. Okay. In Joshua 8, verse 32, that ceremony actually takes place, and the scribes write on the stones. What do they write? Again, Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34:12, or a smallish document that makes more sense that it would be displayed on the stones. It said, you shall write HaTorah Hazot, this Torah, on the stones. Now, it's a small scroll that made a big impact. Aside from the clues of the description that are given in the text, that we have this revival that's driven in a Deuteronomy fashion, like everything that's described, you shall do this and you shall burn. When it says burn, only mention, it's like everything points us to a Deuteronomy-like document. Now, Josiah when he hears this scroll, and it doesn't take long to read. Can you imagine the king go, how much you got left? You know, I have things to do. I'm the king. It's like he's sitting there, he's listening as it's being read, and it says he tears his garments. What would cause him to tear his garments? Well, in 2 Chronicles 34, verse 24, Huldah, the prophetess, the boys in the temple, Hilkiah and the others, they go to Huldah, the prophetess, and they say, hey, there's this scroll that's been found. And she begins to talk to them about the curses that are written in this scroll and how they're going to come upon the inhabitants of the land. But it says, Hezekiah, you'll go to your grave in peace. Well, I mean, he gets an arrow. I don't know how peaceful that was, but he dies in a battle at Megiddo. Arrows from Necho's army, but I mean, maybe that was more peaceful than another way to go. But he's told, you're not going to die right away, but this is what's going to happen. By the way, by 39, he's dead. The most righteous king ever. And we can talk about why. In 2 Chronicles 34, verse 29 through 33, I just want to read those few verses because this is one of the things that he does, that Josiah does with the people. Verse 29 of 2 Chronicles 34, then the king sent word and assembled all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord with all the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the priests and the Levites, all the people, young and old, and he read to them the entire text of the covenant scroll that was found in the house of the Lord. The king stood in his place and solemnized the covenant before the Lord to follow the Lord, observe his commandments, his injunctions, his laws with all his heart and soul. Anybody know where heart and soul appears? Is it in Genesis? No. Exodus? No. Leviticus? No. Numbers? No. Deuteronomy? Yes. 9 times. I don't know. That's just a coincidence, probably. To fulfill all the terms of the covenant written in this scroll. So one of the things I want you to realize is this scroll seems to be, we're building a case for what should be in the scroll. If you haven't noticed yet, we're building a case. Now this scroll is called here Sefer HaBrit, the account of the covenant, the covenant account. You can call it a covenant scroll, covenant book, but it's the account of the covenant is in this scroll. We know that. What else is in it? I don't know, but we know that's in it. And we know that it has something, heart and soul. You should find that phrase in there. The Pentateuch says that Moses wrote the Torah. And everyone believes that, here in this room at least, I think. What was the Torah that Moses wrote? Now, did he write all of our Torah? Or does our Torah contain traces of what Moses wrote? I said this yesterday, but I'll say it again. The book of Jasher is mentioned, but we don't have the book of Jasher. I mean, you can get it on Amazon, but that ain't it, just letting you know. There are other books that are mentioned. The book of the wars of the Lord, right? We don't have that. There's several books mentioned that we just don't have. Question becomes, well, let me ask you this. Do we have the book or the Sefer HaTorah B'Yad Moshe, the scroll of teaching that Moses wrote with his own hand? Listen, the scroll that was found in Josiah's day was not the Pentateuch as we have it. It's just not. And the reason we can say this is because the Pentateuch clearly has evidences that aren't matched up here. I talked about this. I want to make sure you understand. It's not to take away from the sanctity. I'm not talking about inspiration. You can believe whatever you want to believe. What I'm looking for, I'm dealing with the authorship. What did Moses write? No one has a problem if I say, who wrote the Psalms? You say David. Not all of them. And they go, oh, well, yeah, you're right. I mean, you have Psalms of Asaph, you have the Psalms of Moses, you have this, you have that, the Psalms of the sons of Korah. Everybody knows that the Psalms the book of Psalms is a compilation of several different authors. So is the Pentateuch. There are anachronisms. Anachronism is backward time, it means. So it's like you put something out of place. It's a giveaway. You read it and you go, wait a minute, a contemporary writer wouldn't have said that. Here's an example. In the Torah, if you read, in the Pentateuch, if you read where it says, and to this day. Well, somebody reading it and you're reading along, you go, to this day, what does that mean? That sounds like something that a contemporary writer would not write. It sounds like something that someone's writing later that says, when this happened, this is still going on. You go, oh, there's not risen a prophet greater than Moses, right? To this day. Well, if that's like 20 minutes after he died, that's not a big deal. But if it's 1,000 years later, then you go, well, now that's, you see. The order is mixed up in the Pentateuch. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 35, let's look at that one just so you get this. In Exodus 16, I'll only do one, just as an example. Those of you who follow the weekly classes have pages of these, thanks to John. 16:35 says, and the Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a settled land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. You know what? They're not even to Sinai yet, according to the order of things, you see. So the writer is telling us, by the way, this manna that they're eating, that happened until 40 years. No one really takes a break to say, wait a minute now. We're not at 40 years yet. Geography is confused. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, these are the words which Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan. Wait a minute. Did Moses write, these are the words which Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan? Moses never left the other side of the Jordan. Whoever wrote this is on the other side of the Jordan saying, these are the words Moses spoke over there. I mean, it's just, I'm not being ugly. I'm just telling you what it says. Most of the Pentateuch is written in the third person, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, guess what Moses didn't write? Go ahead and none of that. Now, Deuteronomy contains some sections that are in the first person. And listen, here's the difference. If I say, the Lord spoke unto Moses, you say, Moses didn't write that. But if I say, and the Lord spoke unto me, saying, you've been at this mountain long enough. And I told the children of Israel, and I did this, and I did this. Clearly, that sounds different. And there's a reason it sounds different. Only Deuteronomy contains first-person material from Moses. By the way, look at Deuteronomy 31. Even references to the scroll that Moses wrote are in the third person. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, Moses wrote down this teaching, this Torah, HaTorah Hazot, and gave it to the priests, sons of Levi, who carried the ark. There it is. Third person, Moses wrote a Torah. Now look down at verse 24. When Moses had put down in writing the words of this teaching to the very end, he charged the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant, saying, take this book of the teaching, place it beside the Ark of the Covenant, and so forth, and it's going to remain there. Third person, somebody's telling me that Moses finished writing the Torah, and guess what? We still have several chapters left. He wrote it to the very end, and we're not done yet. What does that mean? It means that Deuteronomy, the Bible is telling me that there is a book that Moses wrote, then this isn't it. This is telling us about the book. Well, the book that Moses wrote was discovered in the days of Josiah. It had been forsaken. It had been lost. What did Moses write? Here are a couple of things that he wrote. We have 7 references, just a few off the top of my head. Exodus chapter 24 and verse 4, it says that Moses wrote the words of God in chapter 34, verse 27 of Exodus, it says that he wrote the covenant laws, basically, right? What are those? In Numbers chapter 33 and verse 2, we read that Moses wrote a travel itinerary. Something about the journeys, right? So we ought to be looking for that. So based on these textual clues and a careful analysis of the discovery described in Josiah's days, 2 Kings 22-23, 2 Chronicles 34-35, we know that we should expect the following things in a scroll that Moses wrote. It's going to be like a form of Deuteronomy. We know that. We know that it's going to have the covenant as a central point. It's even called the covenant scroll. We know that it's going to be written in the first person because Moses would write in the first person. We know further that there's not going to be anachronism. If Moses wrote it, he's not going to say unto this day. Bless you. We know that the order and geography is not going to be confused. We know that the travel itinerary should be present. We know that it's going to contain blessings and curses. The curses are what caused Josiah to rip his garments. And by the way, Deuteronomy doesn't even have blessings. Right? It just has the curses, where we're told Moses wrote the blessings and the curses, and then Deuteronomy 27 only has the curses. It's got to be small enough to be read through and written on stones. Be sensible now. You could say, well, you could write on a lot of rocks. Well, yeah. But can you imagine them crossing into the Holy Land and saying, we're ready to move, guys. Where are you at? We're in Genesis 5. Give us a minute. It's a lot. So the idea is it takes a while. The Torah scrolls have 304,805 letters. They're depending on which scroll it is, whether it's Ashkenazi or Yemenite scroll, they're going to be 112 to 148 feet long. That's decent sized font on that. I can read it, not from here, but can you imagine writing 150 feet of, come on. Richard Elliott Friedman reports, and this is, I've read the work that he's reporting, De Wet, a scholar in the 19th century, called the scroll that was discovered the book of Deuteronomy. Admittedly, says it seems to be the book of Deuteronomy. But you know what scholars call the book of Deuteronomy? You ready for this? A pious fraud, a forgery. In other words, scholarship says, you know that story about the discovery of that scroll in the temple? Look, I'm going to wink. It really wasn't discovered. Well, it was discovered like right as they wrote it. Like to champion Josiah's reform. Hey, we need to make a reform here. Now, the reason they said that is because if you look at Deuteronomy and you compare it to the other books of the Pentateuch, particularly the law books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy side by side, you find discrepancies or variations between the accounts. You do. Now, a lot of people say, you just don't understand it. Believe me, they're there. So they're different. Now, why are they different? Scholars said, well, the writer of Deuteronomy is writing later. He's not really using these other texts to get his story straight. You know, like who sent the spies? Well, it depends on what you read. I mean, all these different things like that. So whenever you look at these particular texts, the scholars said it's so different because Deuteronomy, for instance, has a law book within it. Chapter 12 through 26 of Deuteronomy is inserted clearly. Read 11 through 27, you'll see it. It interrupts the narrative. And there are more than 100 laws in Deuteronomy that appear nowhere else in the Pentateuch. What does all that mean? The scholars just say, well, it's a forgery. Pause. Another discovery. 1865. In 1865, Bedouin, east of the Jordan, high up in the Wadi Mujib, the river Arnon, are seeking shelter. They're fleeing from oppressors in the Ottoman Empire. Tanzimat reforms were going on. They're trying to put laws on the Bedouin and put them in conscription and get tax money from the Bedouin. So these guys, these Bedouin, go into a cave to seek shelter to hide, and in there they find leather strips, 16 leather strips, wrapped in linen, coated in asphalt or some bitumen or some black substance of pitch. And they had expected and hoped that there were gold in these wrappings. When they realized they weren't, they cast them aside. But one guy, one of the Bedouin, picks it up, takes it to his tent, becomes rich. You know the story. These represent, they're written on leather strips, 16 in number, 2 copies of a manuscript that's quite interesting. And they're interesting because what was discovered was 2 copies of a manuscript that is the form of Deuteronomy. Covenant plays a central part. It's written in the first person. There's no anachronism. The order and geography is not confused. There's a travel itinerary. There are blessings and curses. It highlights the covenant. And by the way, the 10 words, as you've heard this week, coincide and correlate to the blessings and the curses. And by the way, there are both blessings and curses in this manuscript. It's small. It's about 11 and a half feet, each manuscript. One copy of this manuscript is 11 and a half feet. 21 columns, approximately 2,100 words. Additionally, on these scrolls are what we call interpuncts. So you have, they're leather, they're written in Paleo-Hebrew, and you have dots like punctuation in the text. Now, at the time of the discovery, this had never been seen in leather. Now, lapidary, which means an engraving like a monument, like the Siloam inscription, the Mesha Stela, things like that, they're all over the place. So the scholars that looked at it said, oh, I see what they did. These forgers are sneaky. They put interpuncts to make it look old because they think because old stuff has these, then my scroll has to have them. So they said, this is a giveaway. It's a fake. It's a forgery. Scholars at the time publicly declared it a forgery. Behind the scenes, they were writing one another, say, you know, this is real. If this, as the guys talked about earlier in the week, if this isn't real, Airman, Dave Tyler said, Airman says this, I'll eat those rags. But when the public word gets out, they said, okay, it's a forgery. The story was considered incredulous. Wait a minute. You're telling me that Bedouin went into a cave and in there they found a document that's thousands of years old? Is that what you're telling me? And you go, yeah, I think so. No way. You telling me that a leather manuscript, they didn't write on leather thousands of years ago. This is what they said. Because now you think, well, what, they didn't know about the Dead Sea Scroll? No. This is 80 years before, 70 years before, 60 years before. It's 80 before since the discovery. But get this. So he said, you're telling me that leather strips are going to last in a cave by the Dead Sea. Okay. And then if that were the case, you're telling me that in ancient times they would wrap leather manuscripts in linen, and linen in traces is going to survive? You really believe that? And they said, well, I guess so. And then why would they coat it in asphalt? You're telling me they would why would they do that? It's a fake. There's no way. This is silly. And wait a minute. You're telling me that that's written in Paleo-Hebrew? We don't have any examples of anything written in Paleo, not on leather. We have lapidary, we have stone, but we don't have any leather manuscripts with Paleo writing. And again, you have interpuncts in it. And it doesn't agree with our Bible? Can't be. And then 80 years after the initial discovery in 1865, They voted it down in 1883. 1946-47, this is the wrap-up. Bedouin tribesmen discovered in a cave near the Dead Sea, a place called Khirbet Qumran, many of you have been there, the first of what would be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Leather, many of these, leather, wrapped in linen, coated in asphalt, or bitumen is what they thought. By the way, there's a whole, I'll tell you off camera what it really was, but it's this black tarry substance. 12 of these manuscripts, we now have hundreds, but now the library total, 12 of these have been written or were written in Paleo-Hebrew, 12. All 12 written in Paleo-Hebrew are attributed to Moses. They're Mosaic. If it's not written by Moses, it's not in Paleo. You understand? If it is written in Paleo, it's attributed to Moses. What are the chances? And guess what else they have? They're Paleo, and they have interpuncts. Oh, well, somebody owes Mr. Shapira an apology. Initially, some claimed that these Dead Sea Scrolls were fake, and you know what they said? They said, "You're not getting me on that." Remember Shapira? This is 60 years after the final verdict saying it was a forgery, when they said, "Hey, would you, scholar, sir, would you look at these and tell me if you think they're authentic?" You better get somebody else. You're not ruining my career. Where is the scroll that was found 2,644 years ago? You know, the one that they called a pious fraud. Where is the scroll that Moses Shapira brought before the world? The one that seemed to be a form of the book of Deuteronomy, that the covenant played a central part of it, that was written in the first person with no anachronism, that the order of the itinerary of the travel and the order of events is not out of order, that the geography is not confused, that's small enough to be read and written on stones if you chose to do that. 2,100 words. I write that every 2 days, easy. It was called a forgery by 19th century scholarship. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the preponderance of evidence suggests that as I opened with the phrase, Sefer HaTorah Matzati, I believe from the bottom of my heart that I truly have found a scroll of the Torah written by the hand of Moses, a copy of, let me qualify, in a lengthy letter to Herman Strock on the 9th of May, 1883, Shapira said this: "I'm going to surprise you with a notice of a short description of a curious manuscript written in Old Hebrew or Phoenician letters upon strips of embalmed leather, and it seems to be a short, unorthodoxical, that's his word, not mine, unorthodoxical book of the last speech of Moses in the plain of Moab." And then he describes the manuscript in great detail. And then he closes with this: "I will also ask your pardon for all my daring suggestions and ask you to give me your candid opinion about it, should you or your friends find it so interesting as I flatter myself it to be. Yours, Moses Wilhelm Shapira." And with those words I close saying, offer me your candid opinion if it's as interesting as I flatter myself it to be. Thank you very much.